We can just start with introductions and hear who you are. I'm Sarah Kinsella. I'm a speech and language pathologist with the Special Education Technology Center.
And I'm Sarah Ayers, the other Sarah, and I'm also a speech language pathologist working with the Special Education Technology Center.
I'm going to share our notes here. Okay. So these are the running notes that we have. So every time we have this session, we come back to these same notes. Up on the top here is our YouTube playlist. So we have the other sessions recorded. So if you missed one that sounded interesting, you can go back and listen to them. Right now we have up until December, which was about AAC funding in here. There was one that we did in January that I still just need to edit and get back up on here. But this is the playlist with all the other topics. Here's a link to our social media. And each month is listed here, so you can click on it and it'll take you down to it like a table of contents. So this month, February, our topic was part-time AAC users, strategies and supports. So we know that some students use AAC as an alternative to speech, and some use it to augment their speech. Some students use it some of the time. Some students use it all the time. So there's lots of different ways that kids can use AAC to support their communication. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So Sarah has a few talking points and a slide to go through, but these are largely
collaboration time.
Yeah, collaboration. Yeah. So if you have questions or you're like, oh, that makes me think of a student I'm working with, and you want to talk about that, obviously without their name, but then we can do that. Or if you have questions or if you have resources for the group, we love that too. So it's not, we don't want this to have to be where you just feel like you're sitting and listening. We hope you can join in, but if you want to just listen, that's great too. So I will stop sharing. Looks like we had a few more people enter. So as you're sharing your slides, Sarah, we'll just, I think since we have a smaller group, let's just, if you put in the chat maybe where you're from, what your role is, that would be great.
Yeah, and keep adding that to the chat as we go along. We just love to see the reach that we're having now across people in the United States, which is really exciting too, and across, as Sarah was just saying, the different professions. But we kind of wanted to anchor this in the lived experience of people that we know. And so I invite you all to think of someone you know who is a part-time AAC user. And I realize we have not yet defined exactly what that is. But if you know someone who sometimes uses AAC, sometimes speaks, think of that person. And I'm going to ask you to keep them in the back of your mind as we go along today. But if you feel comfortable, again, you don't have to put any kind of protected health information, but go ahead and write a little bit in the chat. We'll just pause for a minute and tell us a little bit about your part-time AAC user, who they are, maybe their age, what type of AAC they use, what makes them, if you know, why they only use it some of the time. So we have a couple things coming up in the chat. We have someone who uses AAC in bigger groups. A student who has an AAC system that was just recently incorporated in the classroom, a fourth grader who is selectively mute with high anxiety and only speaks at home. I love that. I can think of many students who fall into each of these categories as well. All right, well, you can continue to add things to the chat as we go along. And again, just keep your AAC user, part-time AAC user in the back of your mind throughout our session today. So I wanted to start us off by talking a little bit about what is part-time AAC use. And the next two slides were based in research done by Alyssa Hillary Zisk. And I included a photo here because they are the person standing over here on the edge. And I had the great pleasure of meeting them in December. But these next two slides come out of a presentation that they gave. So part-time AAC users are people who use AAC sometimes, but not always. And then they went into a lot of detail explaining what this could be. This is a theoretical understanding of it, but it could be AAC use that most closely resembles repeated temporary use. So meaning that you use it sometimes and sometimes you don't. You could use it with speech or without speech. Or maybe you are using it in a way that isn't necessarily augmentative or alternative, or temporary, you're just using it sometimes. And then just a note, we'll talk a little bit about language in a minute, but part-time AAC user is an identity term and it may not be used by everyone it could apply to. So just keep it in mind when we're talking about part-time AAC users, that that might be a term that you might want to ask your person, your AAC user, if they are comfortable with that term or how they like to be referred to. And so here's a little bit more on terminology. We linked in here an article done by Assistiveware where they polled many different AAC users and got opinions on what type of terminology they felt suited them or not. And for me, one of the underlying themes of this was that it really just depends on the person. Like for every term, one person may like it, one person may not. So really, again, just anchoring that in who is this individual I'm working with and how do they like to be referred to? So just what this says on the slide is that speaking AAC users tend to like and use the term part-time AAC users. Over 2/3 of participants who use both AAC and spoken words, they like it. But non-speaking AAC users have mixed opinions about the term part-time AAC users. Less than 1/3 like it. So again, it's really just individualized to the person. And then why might someone use AAC only part-time? There are lots of different reasons, and they may or may not fit into these 4 categories. But what we have here are intermittent speech. So maybe the person can speak sometimes, but not always. And that would be where selective mutism fits in. So Linda had mentioned that her AAC user is selectively mute. So they speak sometimes, maybe at home or with people they're comfortable with and not other times. Unreliable speech. So if someone may say things, but that doesn't necessarily, what comes out of their mouth doesn't necessarily match their intended meaning, then they sometimes could benefit from AAC as a way of clarifying what they're saying so that they get across that intention. Insufficient speech. So if a person's oral speech agrees with their knowledge and beliefs, but does not fully meet their communication needs. So basically they can speak, but it's not always accurate. Again, these are just like nuances of the larger term. And then this last one is one that I really like to share about, and it's called expensive speech. So if you've heard of spoon theory, this goes hand in hand with that, but it's where speech is effective. So they are able to use it sometimes, but it comes at a cost to the person. So that could be a cost in terms of their energy or their resources. So if they are using a lot of their energy or their spoons, as you might call it, to speak with mouth words verbally with someone, then they might be more exhausted later on. So it might be something that they use when needed, but it just costs a lot in terms of energy. Any questions or thoughts about kind of the definition of what is part-time AAC use and why someone might use AAC part-time?
I hadn't heard of expensive speech, Sarah, but that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's something that I hear about, especially with our neurodivergent folks. So autistic people talk about it a lot with regards to that spoon theory of like, if you only have a certain number of spoons in your day, where are you going to put all those spoons or that energy? Okay, so we wanted to transition you now to learning from lived experience. I don't typically communicate using AAC, but I have pulled together some quotes and a video from some folks who do. And so I thought it'd be really interesting to listen to what they have to say. So this gentleman, I'm forgetting his name right now, but his handle on Instagram is A Different Spectrum. He posts a ton of videos, reels, and text about his lived experience being an autistic young man who also has Tourette's. And so we're going to listen to just a short clip about him talking about part-time AAC use.
Hi there. Some of you have been asking me about what I do once I get to that. You could say some people call it selective mutism, and I call it just being semi-speaking. It's essentially being nonverbal or not speaking, but not all the time. It happens in certain instances or in situations or if I'm overwhelmed. And it's hard to explain why that happens and what it feels like, but the words just won't come out, and it happens especially if I'm around strangers in a situation where I just feel very uncomfortable or just unsafe. But what really helped me, and what people have asked me about, like what really helps me is that I find a comfort zone, or I bring a lot of comfort items, and that sometimes helps me to really feel safe and be able to feel that I can really get the words out again, because sometimes it does require me to really calm down and find a setting where I feel secure. But it's hard to explain how that works, and sometimes it just won't come out at all. So sometimes you can't force it, and some people can, but it absolutely costs you. It costs you very much energy-wise, so it's not recommended to do it, and it's not very inclusive either. Alternative communication is way better if you have the option. I would say, even if it's just gestures or writing it down or everything, because obviously you still have a lot to say and the thoughts are still there, they just won't come out. And it's hard to explain, but that's how that works for me, at least. Wow.
I just love that video. I want to take a quick pause here and see if what that made you all think of. If anything came to mind, or if you were able to think about maybe some students that you have on your caseload or who you know.
For me, it was a good reframing of AAC in my mind, because I'm often thinking about students who are non-speaking all the time, or at least most of the time. And he's so communicative, right, with speech. And so that was really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes me think of the students that I know who speak like this sometimes at school. And so when, as an SLP, I'm working with a paraeducator maybe, or a teacher, I might get questions like, well, why do we need to train AAC? Because it's hard, right? It can be perceived as a lot of extra work when my student can talk. So I just love hearing him say, that it does come at a cost and that you shouldn't force it. If you do want to follow him on Instagram, he has a lot of other posts about being semi-speaking, as well as many, many other topics. So I'm not going to read these, but we will link these slides into our running meeting notes. So if you want to take the time to read them later. But he, is just, this one went with the video that we just watched, but him saying that it's very hard to explain how it feels, not being able to verbalize your needs or thoughts. It can feel awkward. So I just love hearing him talk about it. And this is really great evidence to show someone who might be resistant to using AAC, because the person still does talk. I'm going to share a few other quotes with the hope that maybe we could chat about them a little bit and what this makes you think of. This quote is from another autistic adult, and it says, "Growing up, SLPs and family pushed really hard for speech. SLPs wanted to push. My family also wanted me to speak. I still remember not being able to explain what I wanted or needed, but having the image or feeling and wishing I could put my hand on someone's head and transfer information that way." It is really interesting, and meeting someone. So when I met Alyssa Hillary Zisk that I showed earlier, the first time I met them, they were communicating using words and spoken speech, and very fluent in the same way that that young man was. And then I went to go see them present at ASHA, and then went and spoke with them after, and they were using AAC, and for the whole presentation used AAC. And they're extremely quick on it, so that helps too. But it is really surprising as the communication partner, because there is a part of us that's like, but why can't you just do it? Because speech feels more efficient, but maybe it's coming with a great cost, or for all those other reasons we listed before.
I could see how this could be really hard for parents too. Like they're saying the SLP pushed and the mom pushed, or the parent pushed, sorry. Kind of like when we're kids, we think about like talking, walking, are they eating enough, right? It's like, I know you can talk, so why aren't you? And I've heard that before from parents too. It's interesting to hear this perspective. And that part where it says, put my hand on someone's head and transfer information that way. Oh,
yeah. It's so powerful. And what I like about this quote is that they say they have the image or the feeling in them. So it's like the concept of what they want to communicate is there, but it's not formed in the language just yet. And I mean, I've been that SLP before too, that pushed, so when we know better, we do better. I always say that, but I think the more that we hear from people with lived experience and hear what a toll it can sometimes take on them to speak, that it just helps us reframe and think about providing options, in the spirit of universal design for learning. And kind of what he talked about before too, of like, it's more inclusive. Just how do you want to communicate? Here are options, and you can choose what works best for you. Here's another quote from Brittany Dube, who is an autistic part-time AAC user. And she said, not speaking with verbal or vocal speech is not the same thing as not having anything to say. The AAC can unlock some of those ideas that a student may have. And here is another quote from another autistic adult. What makes communication successful for me is when I can use the method that works best for me in the moment, and when the other person just accepts that method. I'm wondering what these quotes are bringing up for you all, listening to them. Would you be able to just accept that method if someone transferred over to using AAC, but they were a speaker, or does it make you, would you be someone who would prefer them to speak? What does it bring up for you all? I heard in there, it is common for parents to have some of those myths, right? That we have to break down of like, well, if my child uses AAC, that's going to stop them from speaking, or they're speaking less now because they're using AAC. Sometimes we just have to educate and inform. And so I heard that in your example a little bit too, of what kind of training and education can we do for the parents, but also sometimes parents are worried, right? Like, well, is using this tablet to communicate going to make my child look different or be different? So I love how you brought it back around to what's the goal? Is the goal to be able to imitate what someone else is saying, or to be prompt dependent on, copying a model? Or is the goal to have more of that autonomous or spontaneous novel utterance generation? So, going back to that idea of training and educating.
Speaking of the goal, Sarah, in the chat, Laura says, for me, I think this is the ultimate goal. They should be able to use their preferred method.
Mm-hmm.
And Michelle says 100% whatever works for my student, even in the interim, because I do believe he speaks more when he's with people he feels more comfortable with. I want him to have access to communication with others in real world experiences. And that kind of makes me think about, thinking about like families and speaking more with different people. Sometimes parents say, well, he communicates with me, right? And I understand him, and they do, right? They have a connection. And then we think about those other circles, like what about at the grocery store, or what about with peers, or the different times. And that's kind of what these testimonies from people are making me think about. There's all different situations where we communicate, and that might look different. And for us as speaking adults, right, when we're in a stressful situation, or you're in an argument, or you're disagreeing with your spouse about something, it's hard to find words at that point too, right? So I think there's a lot to relate to.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just thinking about the emotion regulation piece while you were speaking too, of like, even with my kids, sometimes when they're really emotional, really upset about something, I will give them, being an SLP, I will say like this or that, and I'll give them choices or have them communicate, using an alternative method in that moment when they can't find the words or express what they're trying to say with spoken speech. That also makes me think of a student that I went and did an AT consult for, who was in middle school, and his teacher said he's speaking, he doesn't need AAC, but he was having these moments that she was calling selective mutism, and they were usually tied to moments of dysregulation. And he got really upset when we came in, and so I just passed him he's literate, he reads and writes, so I passed him a piece of paper, and he just wrote like stop or something like that, like some protest, and he wrote it and passed it to me. And I showed his teacher, I was like, he is communicating, this is AAC. He's communicating in another way. And so then sure enough, when we offered him a tool where he could type and use that to speak, he was typing away entire paragraphs. He just lost the ability in that moment to use spoken speech, but that didn't mean that he lost his language completely.
That's a great example.
I love the idea of the goal being that they should be able to use the preferred method, because I think historically, the goal was often spoken speech with mouth words. And so I love that we're all starting to shift our goal to being more supportive and person-led, what works best for them. Just wanted to transition us to what challenges and barriers might part-time AAC users face. I can think of a few, but I'm wondering for you all, especially working maybe within systems like a school system, what might be a challenge or a barrier that someone might face when they use part-time AAC?
There's a comment. Speed, familiarity with different screens, finding the correct button. So navigating the AAC system and doing it efficiently. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I've thought about that a lot because if someone is a part-time AAC user, maybe they're not using it as often because they do have speech some of the time. And so with less use of it, maybe they're still potentially learning the device operationally and learning those navigational patterns and how to use it. Absolutely. And we're thinking of that idea of spoon theory. If they've been having this pressure to communicate using spoken speech all day and it's been expensive for them, then how does that work at the end of the day when they go home? Are they just exhausted then? Do they, what is their capacity to engage in the world after school?
I've been thinking about the challenges around readiness of communication partners to be able to hear and understand communication through different methods. I just think about sometimes even, when you're talking with someone and they're expecting you to speak one language and you speak another, at first it's not processed. And so for someone who uses multiple modes of communication, they might encounter communication partners who at first are not ready to hear, and then it would mean being ready to sort of recommunicate a couple times or fixing communication errors or something if someone didn't hear them the first time.
Absolutely. And that makes me think about having maybe a button that's pre-programmed in a device that says, I use this sometimes when it's hard for me to come up with the words, or, whatever the reason is, or let me clarify using my AAC or, something like that. Another barrier that hasn't been mentioned yet that I thought of first was funding. And so for school districts or maybe insurances that might still use the candidacy model, it might be a challenge to get funding for an AAC device for a student who does speak some of the time. So potentially arming yourself as an advocate with some of these resources and studies that you can share if needed, or the data with your AAC user. This is the language that they're able to communicate using spoken speech, and see how highly scripted it is, see how repetitive it is, whatever it might be, versus here is the language that they're able to communicate using a device.
I love that idea of language samples, Sarah, in different settings too. Kind of reminds you back to what somebody said in the chat about initiating conversations and versus other types of speech the student is using. Well, this goes to your next question, I guess. How can we best support students and people who are partially speaking? And I was thinking about reflecting on what Rose said for repairing communication breakdowns, and what you said, Sarah, about having some words or phrases in the devices that help with advocacy. I think we have, as adults, no matter what our role is, we have a duty to help support these people advocate for themselves.
Absolutely. And maybe, if we're someone who works directly with a student using AAC, we take some of our time, if we're a speech pathologist, let's say, in a session to work together to program in some of those advocacy phrases that are ready to go. What do you all think? How are some other ways, what are some other ways that we can support students or people who are partially speaking?
I'm thinking that some students might like seeing the videos, like the video you shared, or hearing from other part-time AAC users.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that. That's a great idea. I think just anytime that we can validate someone's experience and say, hey, you're not the only one. Let me connect you with this other person or this other group of people who experience language in the same or similar way to you. And this is how they support themselves.
I'd be curious to hear from folks who are doing, who are working in classrooms, what has worked, or what ideas you have of how to support with peers. And there's a couple comments. Rose said, it makes me think of last month's session where folks shared about including AAC devices as part of Tier 1 universal design in classrooms, showing how multiple modes of communication can be used and benefit all of us. That's a great point, Rose. Yeah, we talked about how if that's available to all, yes, that's great. And if you want to go back and hear that conversation, it's recorded in our notes. Another comment, I'm attending webinars with parents to learn more about the specific app we use. That's a great idea. So you're doing the training together. I think that idea.
For younger kids, it can be fun to share stories teachers have, especially, I think it's good for all classroom settings, but it's mostly been in the general education classrooms where I do see that teachers are asking for stories that they can read to their younger children. So that's been something that I think can be powerful, and just that idea of the communication differences so that they're from a young age already learning, what those differences are, and understanding that there is no hierarchy, like the way that society has sort of normalized spoken speech as being the norm. So
And in some ways, I feel like society now is better prepared to accept this. I mean, with so many people having smartphones and texting to communicate just naturally anyway, I think that maybe it's not as different or as much of a far reach to communicate in alternative ways using the devices and technology that we have pretty readily available to many of us.
Yeah, I think if we asked students, what are the different ways you've communicated with someone today, right? They would see that. And a good point about stories too. I mean, I remember when I was starting in this field, it was like one book I knew about that highlighted an AAC user, but now there's a lot more, and hopefully more and more coming.
Absolutely. And I think people in society today seem, maybe it's the world I live in, I don't know, but seem to be more ready and willing to share about diagnoses like ADHD or autism and lived experiences. And so I think as more of us are being diagnosed and more comfortable with sharing that maybe we're more likely to share our lived experience and put it on Instagram, for people to find and learn about. It's so eye-opening. Someone who's not in the assistive technology world, to hear from a person who is talking to say that sometimes their language just goes away. I mean, that's really powerful. In our slide deck, we're coming to the end of it, but I wanted to share that there are many, many linked resources here, from blogs to podcasts. This is a presentation. This is a research article. So if you're interested in learning more about what is part-time AAC use and how you can support people who use AAC part-time, there's this list of resources in here, and then many more on the next slide as well, additional blogs and podcasts, and even a Pinterest board in there. So feel free to check those out. And I'm going to stop sharing now just so we can have the rest of the time to talk as a group with whatever. It can be about part-time AAC use, or it can be about anything else too, if folks have other things that are top of mind.